Hey, folks, welcome back to the Change Physician Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my stupendous, my, a, oh, you put too much pressure on me. And
You
now
don't have to say all these adjectives.
I do. Now I need all the special adjectives for describing how wonderful that you are. And I didn't obviously have enough time to prepare these things. But anyway, my amazing co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, whose adjectives simply cannot describe, for another episode of the Change Physician Podcast. So, Melissa, how are you today?
I'm good. It's a beautiful, sunny, a little incredibly hot day here in Austin. But I did run in that weather a little earlier today, so I'm very grateful to get out there before the 100-degree weather.
You were a brave person, and that actually makes me think of a story that will lead into a topic that I want to discuss for this episode.
Okay.
So you're talking about extreme heat, and when I in 2008 I was deployed to Djibouti, Africa. Djibouti, Africa. Since we have an explicit rating, I can say that. Some people will call it as the ass crack of Africa. Part of that has to do that it is at the end of the Rift Valley, which is, the Rift Valley in Africa. It is a spreading part where the tectonic plates have met. It is also one of the hottest places in the world, where hottest habitable places in the world, with temperatures of 120 degrees plus.
Wow.
There's two seasons. There's hot and dry, and then there's hot and wet, depending on when the prevailing breeze comes off of the Gulf of Aden into Djibouti, and Djibouti City, where we were.
Wow.
And so that was, it made me think about that, is because you had to acclimate, obviously, and people would run and you would just like be drenched in sweat. Like when I went to exercise, I actually did it like 5 a.m. before the sun would go up, because it was still really hot, but you can get out there and do stuff, versus these crazy people who are running during the day, sweat. But on that particular deployment, I was deployed with a surgeon from San Diego, who ended up being actually a good friend of one of my co-workers in the pain clinic, who they had deployed previously together to Iraq. And Tom, don't ask me why I gave it. Some reason he had a psychologist friend that gave him all these books, most of them about relationships. And he's like, you should read them. I'm like, you don't know anything about my relationships. And maybe she gave them for you for a reason about your relationship. I don't know. But he gave me this book. This is by John Gottman, who is a psychologist out of Seattle. Actually, here's my boarding pass for my trip home from deployment, actually, because we had these little crazy boarding passes. But John Gottman is a psychologist in Seattle. I can't remember the name of the particular institute, but what he is very, very well known for, and which he actually has data to support, which I also really like, because a lot of the psychological stuff that it puts out, or lots of like common stuff that people have, doesn't have a lot of data behind it. But he's been studying relationships and marriages for long periods of times. And he puts forth a statistic that, based on an interview, a very short interview with a couple, they're predicting divorce they can predict divorce with like 70+% accuracy, if not more, because this book was written a while ago. And so the data has only improved since then. And what I found really kind of interesting about this book is there's 7 particular principles that they say about how to make marriage work. But the ones that I wanted to talk about for today was the signs of difficulty in a relationship. And what he calls them are the 4 horsemen. So if it's okay with you, I would talk about the 4 horsemen of relationship apocalypse.
Let's do that.
So he goes, I call them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Usually these 4 horsemen clip clop into the heart of a marriage in the following order: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And what is interesting about this progression is the worst of these. So if you kind of think about them and which one is actually signs and symptoms or whatever. So the worst one of the 4 out of the criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, you start with criticism when you're finding when you're critiquing your spouse for seeing all the negatives that they have rather than focusing on the positives. That, I think, has an important relevance, because we typically fall into relationships for both the positive as the negative reasons. People don't seem to appreciate that, as a lot of the things that you think drive you crazy are oftentimes one of the reasons that you were initially attracted to your spouse or other relationship person in the first place. But when we start attacking those with criticism, we then can proceed to the second horseman of contempt. And that contempt horseman is particularly dangerous because now we're not criticizing this person for maybe the ideas, but when we're viewing somebody with contempt, we're started looking at who they are. And so now we've internalized this viewpoint where the person that you're involved with, this other person, this relationship, is no longer someone that you necessarily care about in any way. And so once you've reached the contempt stage, it becomes very, very then easy to proceed into the second two, which is defensiveness. So if someone brings up something that may be critical, there's a difference between criticism and critical content, right? So criticism can be harsh, generally unhelpful. But if you can get a critical feedback may not be pleasant, but can provide you information that you need to necessitate change. In fact, it's relevant to it. But if you're no longer willing to listen to this because now you're contemptuous of who the person is talking to you, you start falling in defensiveness where now you don't listen anymore. And then defensiveness, you start doing the buts, or you make excuses where it's not relevant, whatever. It's not important to me. It's just this person telling me these bad things. And ultimately, then that falls into stonewalling, where now you've tuned them out completely, where now they may be speaking, but it's sort of like the Charlie Brown talk of wah, 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 wah. So I find this, I think the book is interesting. I think the concepts are pretty good. I think once I became aware of those four horsemen, I became much more attuned to them in my own relationships, particularly with my own marriage. But if from having heard this in your own personal experience, have you seen with some hindsight bias whether or not maybe those four horsemen have ever been present in any of your previous or present relationships?
Oh, yeah.
End of episode, folks. It was nice to. We'll see you on the next time.
So, question about when they discuss the defensiveness, could that be with the person you're in a relationship with and people that are viewing your relationship, maybe trying to give their opinions or worried about you?
I think there's on two levels. So this book is specifically about the relationship dialogue itself. So it's whenever the other, typically is the spouse that's involved, whoever your significant other is, when you have, and he describes them, and they typically will fall into that criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling pattern, but it doesn't have to be. Like, it's not like it's a linear for all differences. But the defensiveness comes, there's, again, specific about relationship defensiveness. I do think, though, that just like everything, there's the meta and there's the micro and there's and the macro level for this. So if we're looking at this on sort of the micro level, this is specifically about relationships. But on a more meta level, these concepts are as important to communication and societal relationships. So defensiveness comes in as when you're not hearing the message anymore. So that's a long way to say is the book is about interpersonal relationships, and specifically really about those kind of primary ones. But I do think the concept is as relevant to external factors, and maybe someone who are not directly involved in, say, a intimate relationship with, maybe family member, maybe friends, etc., where you are neglecting to hear that message because you simply have stopped listening or responding instead of finding, well, how, what is the information or nugget in this comment, this critical comment that they're providing to me? Well, what about it is true? How could it possibly be true? How can I learn and grow from this? Or what useful bits I can take away, instead of kind of approaching it from that route? Instead, all you're saying, well, that this isn't true. This is why it's not true. This is why it isn't true. And this is, or even worse, who is this person to give me this advice? Who are they to tell me, because, they're mean, they're hurtful, their own life is a wreck, or whatever. We're using that defensiveness to not listen to useful content.
Yeah, well, let me just say that I, from my past, went all the way to the Stonewall. Probably because I found that this relationship was not going anywhere in the sense it was healthy. So from a emotionally manipulative, hurtful situation, and just my own, health in general. We'll just leave it at that. A lot of these, there's no point in the details, the complexities of my prior relationship and prior marriage. Are beyond conversation here. But it is noteworthy that I asked you that question, that I didn't want to hear it from other people that I may have made a poor choice and that I wasn't in a healthy relationship. So it wasn't just within, I think I struggled and tried to hold on to and create it and make it the way I thought and envisioned the relationship should be. But like a recent episode, the future was not going to be any different than the present, because I was still dealing with somebody that did not care about or didn't demonstrate out of behavior a concern for my well-being or my happiness. So, that I had to come to terms with, which took an external situation that happened um, with someone I care about, that I couldn't fathom treating that person that way. So it's very vague on purpose to protect the people. But I, for years, did not have any deep emotional conversations that I was willing to reflect on the situation at hand. And so I think I got to 13 years with this particular relationship, 10 years of marriage, 13 years together. That would have probably, if I had had the capacity, emotional intelligence, and didn't have the naivete, or however you want to say the word. I always feel like I say it wrong. I wasn't so naive. Um, I would have seen things like, in probably that first year would have never proceeded, to the next year. So my pride, my ego, my lack of understanding of relationships um, kept me in an unhealthy situation for 13 years, which, by the way, stunted my own personal growth. So um, I, at that point, completely cut off my relationship, had no desire, despite the fact that I had loved this person for so long. I knew they weren't healthy, so I had to cut off completely. So the extreme version of, I couldn't even want to be in the presence of this person because I was emotionally vulnerable. Um, but in my current relationship, I'd say that I dip into that critiquing, and you got to look at my past, um, even though this person is a different person, I still, I am who I am, and I am human, and I will notice things that are negative or not to, that are not in my control. And if it doesn't, like, it's easy to judge and easy to critique when it's not done the way you do things. I'm talking more like about how you live in your own home, more of like roommate situations, not our love for one another. But um I am also very oriented to the future and achieving, and not really good about being in the moment all the time, which my husband's great at. And so we're yin and yang. And so I can sometimes judge who he is based on how I perceive what is valuable, such as, you know, killing yourself to achieve multiple things that may not even really bring you joy internally. So I'd say those first two I dip in and out of, because I am aware of that, and I recognize I need to change the dialogue in my mind and what I'm noticing. So there you go. Long-winded.
And I think that's, again, when you kind of look at this stuff on a meta level, where it is about interpersonal relationships,
Mhm.
that they are very useful concepts for it, because I think being human, there's a reason that he sees these patterns, is because it's a human related pattern, which means that we're all likely to slip into those things. And
Mhm.
I think in some ways the biggest one, and what Gottman says is the worst thing, is contempt. Like, once contempt has entered a relationship, it becomes very, very difficult to, not necessarily saying it's impossible in any way, shape, or form, but with contempt, that's a bad sign. Like, in fact, I think that's one of the signs they use is like impending divorce. Like, and
Yeah.
it's crazy the data they have on this stuff. Like, it's insane. The other three, though, I think are relevant to who we are and how we've learned to communicate, because stonewalling, which is a particularly damaging form of communication, I've noticed that is very easy for me to do. And like, so you were mentioning criticism may be easier perhaps on your upbringing. For me, the stonewalling as compared to criticism was easier because I don't like, this is going to sound probably weird for some people, but I don't enjoy conflict. Like, I'm a conflict avoider,
Yep, me too.
probably less now than I used to be. But particularly with a relationship, I always associated conflict with end. Like, if there was a it's always weird how you get this stuff,
Mhm.
but it's like, oh, if people fight, then the relationship is over, kind of a deal. So anytime that there was some sort of thing like that, rather than actually and conflict is not necessarily, I don't want to get the impression that everything is perfect all the time. There's a healthy conflict. That could be a topic for another episode, because there's some really cool concepts about that are really useful. But stonewalling isn't, because if there's there's no room, there's no communication with whoever that you're involved with, and they're left with a lot of gaps to kind of fill in. That's just a long way to say is I don't think it's either or, and I don't want to make it sound like that because they're described as the four horsemen, if you're ever critical of someone, that's evil, bad, and your relationship is doomed. It's really recognizing that these are aspects of communication, and what you're looking at is the intent behind it, the awareness you are of that any sort of communication has the deliverer of the message and the recipient. And one of my favorite things about communication is once you've moved beyond the way of, well, you should have understood what I said, to flipping that and taking a recipient perspective and thinking, how are they hearing what I am saying? And if they are not, if how I am communicating is not, if they're not responding in the way that I'm expecting, then it's probably my fault, meaning I am not communicating in the most effective way. But from a relation standpoint, I think the key for this, out of criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, is to be on the lookout for contempt. Because if these more negative aspects of communication start to develop over time, and we start falling into this contemptuous nature to whoever it is that you're involved with, that could be a sign either A, the relationship should end, or B, maybe we need to take a harsh look at ourselves, our partner, discuss, then you're asking yourself to discuss these concepts with a partner, which can be very difficult to do. Yeah, but that's where change then is going to lie. That's where the point where change would really be, is recognizing if contempt is starting to surface, do I want this or do I not want this? Am I willing to change? Are they willing to change in order to eliminate that contempt? I think that's a very good thing to be focused on in any sort of relationship, particularly with your significant other, rather than this idea that there's this Disney-esque thing that you meet somebody, you fall in love, and then there's no conflict, there's no discussion, there's no growth. It's just supposed to be in the happy place that we talked about in another episode, that somehow you just arrive in the happy place and everything's fine and doesn't change. That's not the way it works. There will be conflict in your relationships. There will be episodes where someone is going to perceive your critical content as criticism, that you may be defensive because they're kind of reflecting a little bit something that you don't want to see, but you need to see, and maybe even fall into stonewalling because you want to avoid that conflict. But being aware enough to recognize is it rooted in contempt or not, I think is really, really crucial.
See, this conversation has created a little more clarity for me here, and understanding maybe these four different horsemen you're talking about. But the part I slip into the most is criticism, and I never feel contempt, or at least I don't identify it as that. And I was just looking up the definition to make sure I understood it correctly. the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, worthless, or deserving scorn. I did feel that at some point in my prior marriage, and that's why I left. And I didn't feel respected, and it wasn't healthy, and we weren't making any personal improvement. There was no mutual desire for that. So that was the intuition I had to get out of that. The stonewalling, though, he kind of threw me there, because then I started thinking, wait a minute, like, my parents don't really like, conflict either. And there's a lot of demonstrations, role modeling of just getting quiet. And like you said, there's that abyss of not understanding what's going on in their mind and not communicating, healthy communication. And in my first marriage, this is my second marriage, just for clarity, in my first marriage, I physically and visually can recall the pain I felt when I didn't feel treated well, and I didn't agree, but it's almost like you're trying to be a good person by not being upset. And I internalized it, and I never really had gotten GI pain. Like, I literally felt like I was almost like you just gotten broken up with, and it's just like, it just hits you in the gut. It felt like that for me when I was trying to deal with this like pain of something I didn't feel like I was treated well. And then I just kept tolerating it because I didn't want to like go through that. And so I never was really good about talking about things I wasn't happy with, in regards to how I was treated and all this stuff, things that went on. When I left that relationship, I felt this resurgence of confidence to like be who I am and like speak my mind, and feel like if I was in a relationship in the future that I'd be able to, you know, not be an idiot either with things that may have, been held back from me, whether it was cheated on or whatever it was. And I can say that the thing that's changed the most about me now is that I can have those conversations, about things that are negative. They're still not easy. They're still uncomfortable for me, but I actually do it. Um, but I still have those moments, and my husband catches me on it, where I try to do a little stonewalling because I just don't want to talk about the feelings or emotions, because they're a negative sensation. And so, but he's good about, helping me, and not letting me keep doing the stonewalling. So it's so much better than before. So, I mean, change is possible. But I'm super grateful I have someone that is mutually interested in that personal development, not just as individuals, but as a couple. So my own flaws are fixating on the negative in this OCD perfectionistic kind of like joy is from perfection, whatever that is. So the critiquing, and the, what was the other one? Not contempt.
Defensiveness.
Defense. I'm like, God, I'm probably the perfect example of defensiveness. I'm not as bad as some other people I'm related to, because I'm very aware of it, so I can stop it sooner. But that ego is so like prideful, whatever you want to call it. But the critiquing from the OCD perfectionistic kind of attitude with happiness, and then this like sense of, proving myself because of whatever insecurities lie in there, of trying to prove myself to parents or whoever. And then the stonewalling, I think, is a little bit better changed than the past. But man, the defensive. So I feel like, I have moments of any of those, but I never feel contempt in this particular case. So I say that because it's funny how you mentioned like you feel like that's the worst thing, and I do agree. Because when you get to that place, it's kind of like, you've kind of been, I don't know, it's like giving up and like, I'm done with this. And I don't ever feel like that. But yeah, marriage just takes work. And like you said, it's not necessarily that the other person's the wrong fit and you need to end the relationship. It's like there are things about you that are dynamically interacting with this other person and their flaws and their strengths. And you've got to have both people willing to kind of like, you know, um, what's the word? Call yourself out, have an awareness. Um, yeah, I think you have to check yourself.
So it's making me think on a number of different levels here. I do, like, again, and not necessarily a opinion per se, because it's like, and I don't want us to make it sound like it's us coming forth saying, oh, contempt is the bad thing, but that was from their data. It's when contempt rises its head that really you need to start taking a worrisome look at your relationship, because that's where there's going to start proceeding into this kind of abyssal phase, because you no longer appreciate the person and you don't even feel that they're worthy to provide you any sort of meaningful feedback anymore.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about the other three horsemen with the criticism, the defensiveness, and the stonewalling. Those are going to be present in our communication, really, whether it's with your significant other or any other person, where I have a tendency to default, because those are natural human communication patterns. I think what the major difference is, though, is it almost comes down to a sense of safety, which is, again, outside of the contempt, and and actually willingness. Where do you in your relationship feel safe enough and comfortable enough to both give critical content or communication to the person that you're involved with, and receive that that critical content in a manner that you are not going to immediately jump to defensiveness, or if you do, you are aware enough that you can process and come back and say, hey, you were right. And rather than stonewalling and not hearing it, is to actually listen with intent to try to understand what it is that the person, your loved one, is communicating to you. And because I'm listening to this because I don't ever want to fall in the trap that every relationship is supposed to work. I do think that oftentimes people don't put as much work into a relationship as maybe we need to, because we have this Disney-esque idea that somehow relationships are supposed to be easy or they're not working, which is complete and utter crap, by the way. But trying to figure out, well, when should a relationship end? Because you don't want to see people get trapped into a horrible, I don't want to say necessarily a nightmare, but in a situation where, when is it time to leave? And I do think it comes around this sense of safety. If you don't feel safe anymore or comfortable that you can both give that critical content in a way that someone is going to hear you and appreciate that, and be able to receive from that person information in such a way that that they're not trying to harm you, but they're trying to perhaps provide a perspective that there's a point of conflict around, that may be a good indicator that maybe the relationship shouldn't proceed. Like, maybe that's a point where you as the individual should start really taking a good look and saying, maybe this isn't the right thing for me to do. And again, this is not a relationship podcast in any way, shape, or form. This is still a relationship topic on it. But I do try to work around that, because you see people who are on these, it's where I don't want to go either way, that all relationships, if you just follow these things and recognize these principles, that they're going to work. And if you're not, then somehow you have failed personally. But on the other side of it is that, there's relationships don't require any work. And so anytime things get rough, going to just dump them and then find somebody else, because we've seen those people too.
Mm-hmm.
But you certainly don't want to have people trapped in some sort of relationship where they're not finding joy. The person they're involved with isn't finding joy, and they're just staying in the relationship because of like a sunk cost fallacy, where they've had 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or whatever. And so, we can't get it. We can't change. We can't separate. So anyway, that's probably a whole nother discussion for another episode.
Yeah. Well, everything you said is so true. And my last thing I was going to mention, in order to flourish, to do those healthy communication things, um, I feel like you have to have someone where you feel, like you said, safe. And some of that safety, psychologically, I feel like, even from personal experience, is when you feel like you're loved unconditionally.
Mhm.
and you're not going to be judged and shamed for not being perfect, or criticized in a way that makes you feel less than. And for someone who wants to please others, or be perfect or whatever, when you have that shaming and that, God, I feel like I'm eating my words right now, because I know I've done this to other people. Yeah, it's crazy. You need to have true connection and true growth. You have to feel like it's a two-way street and the love is unconditional.
I here. I totally agree for many different reasons, but
What were you going
I'll
to
hold.
say?
I'm just going to hold off because
Okay.
I do think that is that unconditionality. That's a whole another episode and so important on a significant relationship venue for so many different reasons that we should save that for another episode. So I say, take us out, Captain.
Okay. All right. Well, for those of you joining us today, thank you. And I'm Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my awesome co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And if you don't know about the Change Physician community, you can go to thechangephysician.com and sign up as a physician or a physician ally. We'd love to see you there. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care.
Stay well, folks.